Last week, a huge controversy swept through the competitive Magic scene. Wizards of the Coast sort of quietly made an announcement about how they would be limiting the amount of data that they were going to be sharing from Magic Online events from that point forward. And this immediately caused a huge backlash in the competitive Magic game community, basically saying that this could spell the end of competitive Magic as we know it. So now that we've had a little bit of distance from the event, I thought we could take a minute and dig into whether Wizards of the Coast was
secretly trying to destroy competitive Magic,
or if maybe Wizards of the Coast had a point.
Distraction makers.
Okay, so what was the situation that happened? Wizards of the Coast made an announcement that went out with basically a standard Magic the Gathering online announcement, basically saying they're making some changes to the platform as they normally would, and they also mentioned that they'd be limiting the deck lists. The announcement said, starting today, we have adjusted the number of deck lists posted to mtgo.com from our challenges, trials, and Premier Play tournaments. This will scale more appropriately with the size of the event. Previously, all of these events displayed the top 32 deck lists. Going forward, the amount displayed will be as follows. Events with 64 or fewer players will show top 8, events with 65 to 128 players will show top 16, and events with 129 plus players will show top 32. And at the time of the announcement, Wizards of the Coast didn't really give a whole lot more input based on why they wanted to do this or why they thought this was the best course of action for them to take in this given circumstance. So it really left a void for players to sort of speculate and try to come up with the reasons why they thought Wizards of the Coast might want to do this. So before we get into discussing perspectives, I think it's important to just say that Wizards of the Coast has already rolled back this change. So let's take a look at their rationale for doing so before we get into the sort of different perspectives of the situation. Wizards of the Coast says, we have been trying to solve the problem of Magic Online data being overrepresented versus the population size in data aggregators. Along the way, we got lost in the math of what a representative sample size of these deck lists would look like, and we moved too fast. We do want to help aggregators get more representative slices of the metagame, including tabletop, but we're going to go back to the drawing board on how to do that. Maybe by finding better pathways for tabletop deck lists to get posted on official channels. Maybe by finding ways to highlight additional events, or maybe something we haven't thought of yet. We haven't quite cracked that yet. We've got some homework to do. There's quite a few reasons I could see why players wouldn't be particularly happy with this change. The less data that is out there, the more likely it is that people who are sort of more plugged in are going to get an advantage. So if you're a player who is casually playing in tournaments or playing in Magic Online regularly, but you don't really have the time to really sift and find direct sources of data, it can be difficult for you to sort of keep up with the metagame. And if you're limiting events to just sort of the top 8, top 16, top 32, you're not necessarily giving a particularly accurate representation of what the metagame actually is. There could be quite a few decks that just didn't happen to make it into the top 8 that were sort of one win away, but are still major players in the metagame that we just wouldn't be able to see after Wizards had made this change. And I think this was the strongest and most prominent argument by players about why they were against this change. And we kind of see Wizards of the Coast kind of wrestling with this. We've talked previously on the channel about how Wizards of the Coast has started to adopt a bit of a Yu-Gi-Oh style of deck archetype design, where Yu-Gi-Oh has basically made it so more powerful cards are locked into archetypes. You can sort of control the archetypes that fans have a lot of admiration for so that they remain in the meta. This is kind of a decent solution for players who have sort of come into the game through Universes Beyond and are kind of expecting to be able to play whatever their favorite IP is in a competitive environment and assume that they'll be able to like be somewhat competitive. And Wizards of the Coast has come out and made statements saying that their goal is to sort of make a few of these decks, maybe one for each set, that wouldn't necessarily win tournaments, but would place in the top 8 and be somewhat competitive. And I think generally speaking, they haven't been exactly successful at that yet. Most of the archetypes that they've introduced in this way have been pretty pushed. This would be Izzet Lessons and Elementals probably from Lorwyn. But we'll see as time goes on whether or not they can kind of fine-tune this strategy. Another way that this change could really affect the player base is that brewers would have access to less data. So if you're working on a particular archetype and you're trying to figure out how to make it more successful, you wouldn't be able to see these lists that are sort of being developed over time and learn things from innovations from other players. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword here. Sometimes when you're a brewer, you don't necessarily want your decks to be sort of made public. You might want to keep that information separate, but the information share amongst players probably helps create more successful archetypes than not. The primary example being something like Lantern Control was kind of emerged in this way. It was a strategy that nobody really saw on the radar, and then as players developed kind of behind the scenes, it kind of burst onto the scene and was successful enough that eventually it was banned. Another thing that players might not be thinking about in terms of this data is that content creators use this a lot, especially for metagame analysis or looking for those rogue decks that they can feature on their gameplay channels that sort of fly under the radar but might be worth a second look. This is pretty important for kind of the competitive scene generally, to just sort of keep up with the rapid pace of something like Commander's content ecosystem, to kind of give a pathway for players to potentially get into competitive Magic. And I think the final thing that we do need to touch on here is that this announcement and having it go under the radar without Wizards of the Coast sharing a whole lot of rationale doesn't really inspire a lot of trust in the players. There's also been kind of some unrest in the community generally because of kind of lackluster ban updates or Wizards of the Coast being perceived as being slow to react to potential problems in metagames. And I think this has been most acutely felt in the Legacy format. Wizards of the Coast not only has kind of been slow to update Legacy, but also has been pretty wildly inaccurate with their analysis of the metagames. It's tough to know whether or not that's like entirely true because we don't have Wizards of the Coast perspective. They have access to additional data that we don't really have access to. And I think that kind of brings us back around to this data problem generally. So let's take a minute and sort of steelman Wizards of the Coast perspective here and try to wrap our heads around why they may have wanted to make this change. One thing that we can assume is that Wizards of the Coast is clearly seeing some kind of disparity between the Magic Online events and paper events. So if they're viewing that as a negative, that probably means that there's a difference between Magic Online results and paper results, clearly, right? But we can sort of speculate about what that might be based on the types of players and the sort of play environment that the players are engaging in each of these different areas. There's some different incentives based on how you're playing the games. It's definitely a lot easier to play in Magic Online in terms of getting a hold of cards and also playing in tournaments that happen regularly. There's leagues that happen on Magic Online. So there's sort of a lot more data that comes out of Magic Online, but the incentives for playing there are considerably different. You might be experimenting more. You might be less inclined to try to tune your deck to a particular meta because there's sort of just a lot more there's potentially a much vaster array of things that you might be going up against, which makes it more difficult to specifically target a meta. When we look at paper Magic, though, we can kind of look at previous tournament history and maybe speculate as to where the metagame might go for that particular tournament. And since those tournaments have like a larger prize pool, they sometimes come along. Some of them come along with invites to the Pro Tour, or they might be the Pro Tour. Players have a different incentive in terms of how they would want to perform in that event, which might make them choose less riskier strategies or attempt to counter the meta that they might see emerge from sort of the previous tournaments that are kind of the metagame kind of building on itself. So I could see why Wizards of the Coast would want paper Magic to be heavier, like have heavier representation in the scene. Those tournaments don't happen as often, and also it's theoretically data that's probably more accurate. Something that's really interesting to discuss sort of as part of this conversation is there's a really great GDC talk by Alex Jaffe. He is the, I think, brother of Taliesin Jaffe of Critical Role. And he gave a great GDC talk called Metagame Balance for Esports and Fighting Games. And in it, he sort of poses this idea that we can balance metagames based on matchup percentages, and that if we're trying to base our analysis on play rates, it sort of is a bit flawed because players can choose to play different strategies for kind of whatever reason. It might not necessarily be based on the win percentages. If we do a matchup analysis, we can kind of see which deck in a given meta, in our instance, but fighting game characters in his instance, we can kind of see which has sort of the best matchups against whatever else is there. And generally speaking, if one of these is vastly outperforming the others, we can sort of use our matchup charts to say, okay, well, given enough time, the meta will coalesce around this one particular strategy as an outlier. And ideally, you would build a metagame that if the meta was to coalesce around that strategy, it would then prop up other strategies to be played to sort of turn over the meta on its own. And I'm sure that this is Wizards of the Coast goal. There's always been talk of them targeting 4 to 8, maybe 12 decks in like sort of eternal formats as being viable in a metagame. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a best deck at any given time, but if there is a best deck, there should be a weakness in that strategy for other decks to sort of exploit. So check out Alex's video. There's a link in the description for it. It's really fascinating. And he also talks about this fictitious play algorithm that allows you to sort of extrapolate a Nash equilibrium from a matchup chart. which would then let us know, okay, well, if any of these strategies are too outside the bounds, that's the one that will inevitably become the dominant strategy. I think this also makes me realize that we should probably be looking more at matchup charts than we should be looking at sort of play percentages. Now, Magic works differently than fighting games, and competitive players are very data-driven in Magic the Gathering, so it probably is a closer one-to-one in Magic between play rates and win rates, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the case. The other problem that we can run into is kind of a follow the leader problem, which I think might be the thing that Wizards of the Coast is more worried about. When you have a lot of data coming out of Magic Online or a system that has a lot of reps that players are taking, or a system that just sort of is like turning out a lot of data, especially one where players aren't necessarily incentivized to metagame against or to strategize against a metagame, it's possible that those play rates end up very like much higher than they wouldn't be in paper, and then players assume, oh, that's a high play rate, it must have a high win rate, I should get on board and play that strategy. This is also something that Alex touches on in his GDC talk. I think it's also important to touch on content creators again for a minute, in that we talked in the past about how there's kind of this content creator metagame that's happening, where you're getting a lot of there's sort of different incentives for content creators than there are for tournament players. Like, obviously tournament players want to win the tournament, but content creators are looking for views, which might skew the metagame again towards this particular problem, especially when reinforced by Magic Online data. So if Wizards of the Coast could instead inject more of this paper data into that ecosystem, I think it might give us a better read on what's actually going on. And because content creators kind of sit in between pro players and enthusiast players, it's a sort of it's how this information sort of gets put out into the ecosystem of competitive Magic. I think the most healthy way that this would work is that you sort of get this information from pro players who have different incentives than content creators, to sort of then have that information be filtered through content creators to enthusiast players. But instead, we often see this feedback loop between content creators and players, where they're just sort of building and building and building on each other, and we end up with a lot of narrative that is a metagame is broken. Whether or not it sort of actually is, this sort of brings us back to Wizards of the Coast sort of proposed solution that they already rolled back, so we know it's not happening. But I do want to talk about the fact that this is the route that they chose to try to fix this problem, and it's a little, I don't know, I feel like I kind of disagree with the methodology here. I think at the end of the day here, even if Magic Online is represented out, like has an outsized representation in the data collection here, it's still potentially a poor meta, right? Like, you're still subjecting players to that metagame, even if it's just in Magic Online and not represented in paper. But like, that doesn't mean it's not a bad meta, right? So that data is still important, which I'm not necessarily saying Wizards of the Coast isn't saying, but there's sort of two approaches here, right? And it's that if metas are sort of being solved too quickly, or are being homogenized around particular strategies, you could limit the data and make it so that happens slower, right, for Magic Online in this instance. Or you could potentially share more data and allow for players to sort of construct these metagame matchup charts and allow players to have a more informed decision about what to choose. But that would require you to make sure that the game has the ability to turn over its own meta. I'm not saying that Wizards of the Coast is doing this so that they can hide poor design or, bad metas or whatever it is. But I do think that this was probably a way to alleviate some of the problem in the easiest way possible. I do feel like in this situation, Wizards of the Coast wasn't really accounting for the fact that this data is really important to things outside of just tournament results. And I don't know if that's up to them about like how important that is. But I do think that even in terms of the competitive player ecosystem, then you're sort of cutting the legs off of like competitive player content creators that are trying to sort of build an ecosystem to get players into competitive Magic. It would almost make more sense to release more data to allow more accurate matchup charts to be made. I think the other risk that Wizards of the Coast runs by obscuring the data is that metas still will get solved, right? It just might take a little bit longer. And players are probably going to be looking for alternative ways to get a hold of this data anyway, right? Like, they're not going to just eventually something will come out. We have things like 17 Lands on Arena that tracks everybody's draft performances. There are these sort of third-party apps that end up reporting this data anyway. So I think my takeaways from this situation is really that Wizards of the Coast should probably just be more transparent about why they wanted to make this decision. Even in their rollback, I think they were just sort of a little cryptic. If they could just, I feel like being open and honest about the situation, and especially with competitive-minded players, they tend, when they're sort of presented with a rationale and data for a problem, I think they tend to be more willing to say, okay, there might need to be a tough solution here. So let's, as a community, come together and figure out maybe what that should be, instead of these decisions sort of just being from the top down without any kind of discussion. And I know that like this sort of runs the risk of something like what happened with Hybrid Mana in Commander, where the player base just basically rejected the idea without really hearing out the arguments. But like I said, I think competitive players are generally more willing to sort of like walk through the analysis, even if at face value they don't necessarily agree with the proposed solution. I also think that like more data is probably better here. As players, I think the thing that we can do is be better about looking at that data. Instead of just relying on play percentages, we should be looking at matchup charts. And that way we sort of have a better understanding, because play rates aren't representative of how well these decks are performing. It just is the more likely you are to run into those things, which is a perception problem, but doesn't necessarily mean that the meta is broken. And I think that's part of what Wizards of the Coast is trying to do with getting more paper data into the ecosystem, or at least weighing the paper data differently. Is if they do that and those metagames are more diverse, you're theoretically going to change the play rates of these decks and maybe see that the metagame is a bit more healthy than what it looks like just from the online data. If they choose to go the route of allowing more data in here to try to outweigh the Magic Online data, it does come with like a bit more upkeep, right? Like if that more data comes out, we get that information faster, we get those matchup charts made faster, and then the game becomes more about the meta game choices of this is the deck I think is going to be popular, so I'm going to choose one that I think subverts that. If like level 0 was the deck that people played last week and level 1 is the deck that beats that deck, and then you choose level 2, which would be the deck that beats the deck that people are trying to choose to beat the deck that was good last week, that's the kind of metagame turnover that we're talking about, is that it becomes more a game of deck selection, and then still the game of Magic must be played and you have to be playing the game of Magic. That sort of becomes more the metagame, rather than looking at the field and thinking, well, this is just the most broken deck and that's the one I'm going to pick because everybody's playing it. Why would I bother playing something else? Nothing else is beating it. But in any case, a bad meta is a bad meta, and we shouldn't, Wizards of the Coast should not be subjecting players to that meta, even if it's one that they see as less important than any other. And I think the biggest drawback to limiting tournament information from Magic Online is really hurting the content creator space. It's also hurting players that just aren't as willing to upkeep on the information as much. So they might just be completely blindsided by the meta if they go and play an event that they don't go too often, which might discourage them from joining an event again. There's the flip side that there are other players that do like that unknown, but I think generally speaking, the culture of competitive Magic has become one that's more about the metagame game, in that you sort of understand your matchups, you choose the decks appropriately for what you think is going to be good at the event, you go to the event and you play, and you sort of get some amount of edge based on the fact that you picked a deck that has good matchups against what is there in the field at that particular tournament. Okay, well, what do you think? I doubt anybody thinks that Wizards of the Coast was correct in making this decision. The backlash was pretty fast and severe. But what do you think about the matchup charts? Do you think that's what we should be looking at? If you know of any good resources for matchup charts online, please share them in the comments as well. And hopefully we can kind of maybe steer things towards a more healthy perspective on the metagame rather than just looking at play rates. So thanks for watching. If you want to join the Discord and have more discussion on this, the link is in the description, and we'll see you next time. Bye.